हरे कृष्णा ऑल ऑफ यू। सो आज हम डिस्कस करने वाले हैं अजूर नेटवर्क्स। सो इन टुडेज टॉपिक we will discuss on Azure Virtual Network. First of all, we need to understand what is Azure Virtual Networks and why Azure Network need to be discussed. So you know very well, Azure Virtual Network are fundamental building blocks of any private network in Azure. And VNet enables you to build complex virtual networks that are similar to on-premise network with additional benefits of Azure infrastructure such as scale, availability, isolation. So means it is very similar to on-premise, but we are providing scalability, availability, and isolation. So if we are going for the definition of virtual network is an isolated environment provided by cloud provider. Okay, so it is the representation of your own network in the cloud. So it is the logical isolation of Azure cloud dedicated to your subscription. So first of all, we need to understand about the capabilities of virtual network. So capabilities are communication with the internet, communication between Azure resources, communication between on-premises resources, filtering network traffic, routing network traffic. So first of all, let's understand communication with the internet. Communication with the internet means whatever the resources in the VNet can communicate outbound to the internet by default. Okay, you can communicate inbound to a resource by assigning a public IP address or public load balancer. Now, going for communication between Azure resources, you know very well that if we are deploying any resources in Azure environment inside the virtual network, so uh, these resources uh, should be communicate with each other as per our requirement, or it is possible that our requirement is like we wants to communicate with another virtual network. So how can we communicate with it? Like we have VNets, we have VNet service endpoints, we have VNet peering. So using VNet peering, you know very well that other virtual network can be communicate to other virtual network via Microsoft Backbone peering network. Okay, so this is the communication between Azure resources. Or for example, we have SQL database and storage account, and we want to communicate uh, with our virtual machine, for example. So we can use service endpoint. By service endpoint, we can make a connection between Azure resources like Azure SQL database and storage account and the virtual machines. A virtual machine inside the VNet. So we will establish the connection, service endpoint between VNet and SQL database and storage account. So this is the way we can communicate between the Azure resources. Now, communication between on-premises resources. So, for the on-prem resources, we can communicate, about site-to-site VPN connection, point-to-site VPN connection, and Azure Express route. We will discuss more about it. Now, filtering network traffic. So, as per our requirement, depends on customers, we can filter network traffic between subnets using combination of network security groups, network virtual appliance like firewall, gateway, proxies, and NAT, address translation services. Okay. Now, routing network traffic. How to route a traffic it is up to, because there are two routing methods, that is, um, Azure provide is, um, uh, means system defined routing, and we can define our routing via the user defined routing. So by these methods we can route traffic, and you can implement the route table or broader gateway protocol to route to override the default routes Azure creates. Okay, so this is the capabilities of virtual networks. Now we are discussing uh, the virtual network design considerations. So first of all, we need to understand what is the address space and subnets. So address space is like, uh, if you are going to create any virtual network. So if you are going to create any virtual network, so it is recommended that, let me go to my uh, why this explanation. Like, if we are going to uh, define any virtual network, so what is the recommendation? The recommendation that we need to use RFC 1918. Okay, RFC 1918 address space we need to use. So what are the non-routable address space? So like 10.0.0.0 to 10.255.255 dot, sorry, dot 255. So this is the address space we can define. This is slash 10 or slash 8 prefix. Okay, now second one is 172.16.0.0 to 172.31.255.255, it, and it should be 172.16 slash 12. Okay, and third one is 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255. It is 192.168 slash, how much it, for 16. Okay, so these are the address spaces under RFC 1918. We can define the virtual network accordingly. Now, in addition, we cannot add the following address spaces. So, cannot use the following address spaces. Okay, which are these? These are 224.0.0.0 slash 4. Why we cannot use it? Because it is used in multicast. Okay, now if we are discussing about the 255.255.255, it is reserved for broadcast. Fine. Now 127.0.0.0 slash 8, it is reserved for loopback. Okay, now 169.254.0.0 slash 16, it is reserved for link local. Okay, and last one is 168.63.129.16 slash 32, it is used for internal DNS. Okay, so we need to remember this whenever we are going to deploy any virtual network, we can use these RFC 1918, and we cannot use uh, the following address spaces. Why? Because these are reserved IPs. Okay, so we need to taken care whenever we are going to deploy. And another thing I want to let you know, like whenever we are going to deploy a virtual machine inside the subnet, subnet is inside the virtual network. Like subnet address space is 10.0.0. For example, 1.0 slash 24. It is the address space for the subnet. Okay, and we are going to create the virtual machine. What we are going to deploy? Virtual machine. So if we deploy a virtual machine inside the subnet, then what will be the address space for the virtual machine? Means what is the private IP for the virtual machine by default? It is 10.0.1.4. So you are having the question, where are the five means previous IPs like dot 0, dot 1, dot 2, dot 3? Where are these? So Azure always speaks that there are five IPs, at least five IPs, which are reserved by uh, means backend. Like uh, for example, we are saying that where is 10.0.1.0. So this IP is reserved for network address. So we need to remember this. Always remember this, that 10.0.1.0 is always for network address. Now 10.0.1.1, it is for default gateway, Azure default gateway. Okay, so it is reserved. Now about the 1.2 and 10.0.1.3. So both are reserved for Azure DNS IP. Yeah, Azure DNS IP. Okay, to VNet space. So why these two IPs are for Azure DNS? It is reserved by Azure to map the Azure DNS IP to VNet space. And the last one is 10.0.1.2555. It is for network broadcast address. Network broadcast address. So it needs to be remembered always that these five IPs are reserved. First four IPs 0, 1, 2, 3. 0 is for network address, 1 for default gateway, 2 and 3 for Azure DNS IP, and 255 for network broadcast address. And whenever we are going to implement virtual network, so if we are saying I am going to deploy virtual network, in short form I am writing as VNet. So we need to consider the following points. First one is there is non-overlapping or non-overlapping of address space. So we need to ensure that there is no overlapping address spaces. We need to make sure that VNet address space means CIDR block does not overlap with organization or other network ranges. Okay. Now, second point is second point is there any isolation required, security isolation required? We need to take it consideration. And third one is, do you need to mitigate any IP address limitation? Okay. Fourth one is, there is any connection between Azure VNet or on-prem network. Okay, and is there any isolation required for administrative purposes? Are you using Azure services that create their own VNets? Okay, so these are the considerations for virtual networks. Now, let me small it. Now, so going to subnet. Subnet. What is the subnet? Subnet is a range of IP address in the VNet. Means whenever we are deploying any virtual network, so for example, we are deploying 10.0.0.0/16, and as per our requirement, this is the VNet address space, for example. Okay, so we can define multiple subnet inside it as per our requirement. Like we are defining subnet 1, for example, 10.0.0.0/24. So subnet is a range of IP address in the VNet, and we can segment VNet into different size of subnet, creating as many as subnet as you require for organization and security within the subscription limit. So it is all about the subnets. Okay, and each subnet must have a unique address space range. Means we should remember these address space cannot be overlap. It should be unique address space range. And for example, we are using Bastion subnet. So certain Azure services require their own subnets. So the subnets have a specific name for that services. So we need to remember this, right? Now, what are the naming convention? So if we are working for any organization and we are going to deploy any of the virtual network or any resources, then it should be follow a naming convention. Okay, so we need to remember it. First of all, there should be resource type. What is the resource type? And then workload or application name, workload or application name. Then environment, what is the environment? Then region, and then instance. Why we are considering naming convention? Because whenever we are going to design any Azure network, it is important to plan a naming convention for the resources. An effective naming convention composes resource name for important information about each resources. A well-chosen name helps you quickly identify the resource type, its associated workload, its deployment environment, its region, hosting, etc. So, for example, we are going to deploy VNet. So, how can we write the name? Like resource type is VNet. Workload type, for example, I am showing you for demo. Okay, so I can mention his demo, or otherwise you can mention it is like for SAP environment, SAP application, or you can say it is for SharePoint application, you can say it is the um, water application, anything. So you can mention here the application name or workload type, workload name. And environment, what is the environment? Like prod, non-prod, test environment. So I am writing here test environment. And region, you can specify the short name of the region, like you are deploying the resources in UK based region, so you can write here UKW. And instance, you can make the count of this, like it is the 001 VNet. Likewise, if you are going to create any virtual machine, so you can mention here like VM, and a workload type like application is SAP environment, VM SAP, and environment name is it is like for prod, so you can mention prod. It is deploying in North Europe, so you can mention NEU, right? And count, instance count is 001. It can be increased like it is 4 times 004. So likewise, you can means consider the naming convention. Now, whenever we are going to deploy any of the resources, we need to understand what are the regions, what are the subscriptions. So whenever, for example, I am going to deploy the virtual network. So where virtual network can be deployed, it should be in a particular region because I am mentioning in naming convention that is the region. Region means UK West. I am considering to deploy the VNet in UK West region. So first of all, we need to identify in which region we are going to deploy our resources. Okay, so after that, we need to understand in which subscription we are going to deploy our resources. So, because whenever we are going to work in any of the live environment or production environment, uh, or we are working for any organization, then there are some projects and we need to work on particular subscription. So there may be multiple subscription and we need to identify in which subscription I want to going to deploy the virtual network. So we need to identify which subscription we are going to deploy it. Now, if we have good understanding of regions and subscription, we also understand what is the Azure availability zones. So we are going to study about availability zone. Okay, so availability zone enables you to define unique physical location within a region. Each zone is made up of one or more data center equipped equipped with independent power, cooling, and networking. Why it is designed? It is designed to ensure high availability of Azure services. Physical separation of availability zones within region protects application and data if data center failures. So we can understand by using this diagram. Like these are the three regions. Okay, and I am naming as AG1, it is AG2, it is AG3. So these are the availability zones, and these availability zones are connected to each other for better reachability. For example, we are going to deploy any of the resource in all of three availability zones. So, for example, if this availability zone goes down, okay, so if these are connected to each other, we can use our resources in availability zone 2 and availability zone 3, right? So it provides the redundancy as well. So we need to understand for higher availability, uh, availability zones, what can provide. So Azure services that support availability zone fall into three categories. First is zonal services, second one is zone redundant services, and third one is non-regional services. So zonal services are, for example, virtual machine managed this for standard IP addresses can be pinned to a specific zone, which allows for increased resilience by having one or more instances of resources spread across zone. Now, zone redundant services. What does it mean? Resources are replicated or distributed across zones automatically. Azure replicates data across three zones so that any of the zone failure does not impact the availability. Now, non-regional services, what are these? Services are always available from Azure geography and are resilient to zone wide outages as well as region wide outages. Now we are going to understand how to create the virtual machine. So for example, now I am going to portal.azure.com. So you know about it, how to log in it. So I am going to log in into Azure portal. Right. So I am going to create a resource. Which resource I want to create? I want to create a virtual network. So I can type here virtual network. So I am selecting virtual network. Okay. So virtual network. So this is the subscription where we wants to deploy it. Now you can create a resource group. So you need to remember what is the naming convention like RG. I am going for the demo purpose. So I am naming is demo. It is for test, and in which region we are going to deploy UK West for example and 001. So I am following the naming convention, and you should also follow the naming convention as well. So uh, I am going to vnet demo test UKW 001. Now it is for UKW, UK West. Now IP address, for example, it is 10.0.0.0 and default is this. We can add subnet here and mention a name like snet demo test UKW 001, and I am mentioning like 10.0.1.0/24. I can mention here. Now add it. Now security. Now tags. We can mention any tag like I'm mentioning here purpose, and purpose is for test. So here we gone through address space. Address space is what CIDR. Space is classless interdomain routing format. Inside the classless interdomain routing format. So I am going to create it. Okay. So yes, it is going to deployment in progress. So you can see here our VNet is VNet demo test UKW001, and we can see address space of our virtual network. This is 10.0.0.0/16, means it is ranges between 10.0.0.0 to 10.0.0.255.255, and total address space count is 65,536. And if I am going to subnets, there are two subnets. One is default subnet, and both are having /24 CIDR, and available IPG is 251 instead of 256. 5 IPs are reserved. I already explain you first four IPs and last one IP are reserved. First IP dot 0 is for network address, dot 1 is reserved by Azure for the default gateway, and 2 and 3 are reserved by Azure uh, to map the Azure DNS IP to the VNet space, and 255 is network broadcast address. So it's all about today's session. We will again connect for the time being. Bye bye. Hare Krishna.